So I hope you're all looking forward to Christmas. This is Ilya Shpitser, who I'm very pleased to welcome here. He's from Johns Hopkins University, the Department of Computer Science, and he's an expert in causal inference, missing data, semi-parametric models, graphical models, and more than just that. And he's here at the moment for the program at the Isaac Newton Institute on causal inference. He'll be speaking next week. I think that's right, isn't it? Or is it the week after? Next week.
I think next week, yeah.
Next week at the Isaac Newton Institute. And I'll let him start talking. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ilya. Thank you, Sean, for having me. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So as Sean said, I'm in town until early March. So if you want to chat about this or other stuff, I'm across the way at the Isaac Newton Institute, which is a little right here. I found out today. This is okay. So this is a missing data talk. This is a missing data talk about imputation. And it is joint work with my talented student Trung and our wonderful undergrad Kyle, and my former students Rohit and Razi, who now are faculty with students of their own. Rohit is right here in the room. And my former postdoc Dan, now at Columbia, and my good friend Barry. So I gave this talk a little while ago at Cornell, and there was somebody who kind of followed my work, and then they said, wait a second. Didn't you give this? Are you running a scam, Ilya? Like, didn't you give this talk 5 years ago at the online causal seminar? And it's sort of half right. Like, I gave the first half of this talk a while ago, but I need to give the first half again because the second half is not going to make any sense. Basically, the second half is like new stuff, which is imputation for the first half, for the model in the first half. So if you've ever been attending the online causal seminars, some of this might seem familiar to you. That's not an accident. Okay, so this is about missing data. Everyone I have yet to encounter an applied project that didn't have missing data in it. Maybe that's possible, but usually if that happens, what that means is somebody took care of it for you already, either that they pre-imputed for you or they just like restricted to complete cases before you got the data set. That's usually the way that happens. So there's always missing data, basically. And given that, so I taught machine learning at Hopkins in the fall. I teach it sometimes, and I always include missing data there because I really feel like it's criminally undertaught in general in data science classes. Like in biostats, people tend to teach it. In stats, maybe. In machine learning, definitely not. They think of it as a data cleaning issue, and I think it's a real pity. Because a lot of all these things I've mentioned, which is how missing data arise, they're all structured, right? You have to model how censoring happens and think carefully about what that implies. And people kind of don't do that, and that creates problems. And so if you want to be formal about dealing with censoring, structured censoring like this, you could try to model missingness status, which leads to these Horowitz-Thompson estimators that people came up with in survey data, or more generally, these inverse weighting or augmented inverse weighted methods that people in semi-parametrics came up with. So that's if you model missingness status. So the idea in missing data is you have an evil, horrible gremlin who got a hold of your complete data and starts flipping coins. And whenever the coin is head, the evil, horrible gremlin puts a question mark in that cell and then keeps going. And then people think about how is it that that coin operates? Does it depend on other things? And so we'll get more into that. And so you could also try to address missing data. Like you could think about the coin, which is missing the status, thought of as a random variable, or you could try to model how missing values actually happen. So you could try to come up with some sort of censoring model for the whole likelihood and then fit it by EM somehow. And it better be that you are identified. And as usual, people don't think about identification as much as they should. Or people can impute. Imputation is very popular because it follows this principle in computer science we call encapsulation, which is, if there is something complicated to deal with, like missing data, like I want somebody to deal with it for me, and then I don't have to think about it, and then they have dealt with it for me and given me a nice, clean data set with no question marks left in the data set, and then I can do the analysis I really want to do. And in practice, if you don't have somebody who knows how missing data works, you do the next best thing is you download a package from CRAN called MICE, and then you run MICE, and then you have a nice complete data set, and you pretend that the package is kind of like your colleague who knows about missing data, even though it's not. It's actually either MAR or nonsense, depending on how you choose the imputation densities. We'll get to MICE later. Okay. So ultimately we'll get to imputation. So we'll try to do something reasonable with imputation. And I am a causal person. So in causal inference, we have this idea of counterfactual variables, which is variables that would have happened had something occurred, not necessarily what actually occurred. And there is some utility to think of missing data problems in this way. Now, ever since Don Rubin's days, we've known that causal inference is a kind of missing data problem, but you could also think about missing data in causal terms, and that's often helpful. I learned this notation from Jamie Robbins back in the day, and I find it very helpful. So we're going to have two kinds of X variables. We're going to have the underlying X, and we're going to have the observed X. The underlying X is what you hope you see, had there been no evil, horrible gremlin putting question marks in your data. Observed X is what you actually see. So the observed X is either equal to the underlying X, or it's equal to question mark if the evil, horrible gremlin had their way. Okay? Okay. And the analogy, so you notice that the underlying variable has a little parenthesis 1 in there. And this is a syntactic analogy to causal inference problems. It's a variable had you been able to see it. So here, the parenthesis 1 refers to the value 1 of the observability indicator R. So it's what would the value be for this variable had somebody hypothetically intervened on that indicator and forced it to be 1, which indicates observability. Okay? So you could kind of think of the observed xi as the observed treatment, the xi1 as the counterfactual treatment, and ri as the treatment variable. Sorry, the xi1 as the counterfactual outcome, and xi as the observed outcome. So viewed in this way, this definition that relates xi, xi1, and ri, it's basically the missing data version of consistency. So in causal inference, you have this idea that I have two versions of the outcome, y1 and y0. And if the treatment is 1, y1 becomes observed, becomes y. And if treatment is 0, y0 becomes observed, becomes y. So in missing data, it's kind of like that, except there's only y1. It's like one-sided. y0 is question mark. y0 is not interesting. Okay. So the observability indicator either selects y1 to become observed, or it selects question to become observed. Okay. But it's basically just a consistency property. Okay. Sometimes people write xi for the underlying variable and xi ops for the observed version. I like this better because it makes it clear what's actually counterfactual and what's actually observed. I don't know if this is very common notation, but I definitely, you'll see later why it's a direct analogy. Okay, so this is some notation. We're going to talk about vectors of variables. We're going to talk about all the variables but xi with the minus I. And we'll have various names for distributions. Target law is the set of variables that are potentially missing and the set of variables that are always observed. That's like variables in my problem. Typically, if I have missing data problems, in other words, I have a data frame with question marks in it, I think of that data frame as coming from some distribution that kind of has these missing variables and O's that are always there. And usually we want some function of that distribution as our target parameter. And that could be whatever. It could be a predictor if I'm doing machine learning with missing data. It could be a causal effect. If I'm doing causal inference with missing data, it could be anything. Or it could be the whole distribution, whatever. The nuisance law is just what they call a propensity score in causal inference, except that there is a vector of R's. Remember, R's are observability indicators. Because I have multiple missingness variables, I have multiple indicators. So I have this high-dimensional quote-unquote treatment. And this depends on underlying variables and observed variables. And so because it depends on potentially missing variables, it's not potentially identified. That might be an issue. We'll get to that. It's called nuisance law by analogy with nuisance functions, semi-parametrics. It's probably something we need to know, but it's not something we usually care about. We just care about the target law. Yes?
Are you going to consider different variables missing at different times? At the moment, it seems
there is no time so far, but it's
different units, different individuals. At the moment, it's either they have X or not X. But what if there's another variable Y? Some have X missing, some have Y missing. So
yeah, you mean like different people are different rows?
Yes.
Yeah, you could have different realizations of R's for different rows. That's fine. That's this, basically.
Should I think about R as a vector?
Yeah. Well, R has a little arrow over it, so that's a vector, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, sorry. I just put x1 as an example, but it's vector notation for everything. Yeah. Okay. Then we have the coarsening model. Coarsening model is just it's a deterministic degenerate distribution that just encodes consistency, just relating the underlying x's and the observed x's with question marks. And we also have the observed law. The observed law is the distribution from which the actual observed data frame comes from, where we don't have x1s, but we have x's potentially with question marks, and we have the indicators, and we have the fully observed variables. And so if we want the target law, then by chain rule, we could represent the target law as this ratio over there. And so the numerator in this ratio is observed data by consistency, because we're evaluating the numerator at all the R's happen to be 1. And the denominator of this ratio is the missing data version of the propensity score. And that might not be identified because you depend on things that's missing data potentially. Now, if you're MAR, maybe that won't be true, but in general, it will depend on this, and then you have to be careful. And because of chain rule, essentially identifying the target law is the same thing as identifying the propensity score, the nuisance law, evaluated at R equals 1. They're the same problem. If I know one, I know the other, because it's a transformation up to that observed numerator, basically. Okay, so this is just some very basic preliminaries. So this is the counterfactual view of missing data. I have some distribution over underlying variables, and I'm interested in some parameter. This parameter could be a single number, like the outcome mean, or it could be a complicated surface, like a predictor. Doesn't really matter. And standard statistics or machine learning is I have IID samples from the distribution, and then I do some full data problem, which is statistical inference or empirical risk minimization or whatever. And then missing data has this extra wrinkle where an evil gremlin messes around with my distribution and puts question marks based on the observability indicator. And we want to capture the behavior of that gremlin's misbehavior of that gremlin by just thinking of some sort of coarsening process that has something to do with R given all the variables. And that leads me to an observed distribution. And then it is from this distribution that my data frame actually comes from. And in this distribution, in this data frame, we have some question marks where we don't know what the value is. And we can also figure out what the coin flip must have been. Because whenever there's a question mark, it came out 0. Whenever there is no question mark, it came out 1. And so this is what my data frame would look like in missing data. The first 4 rows are artificial. We just put them in. We can figure out what they are by looking at what the question marks are. Okay, and the point is that in missing data, we want to solve for the theta in the full data using this observed data frame. So the reason I mentioned this is because there is a school of thought in like machine learning, for example, where they say, oh, I have question marks in my data and I would like to predict some outcome. So, but my question marks occur systematically. So I'm going to use the fact that the question marks are systematically by just occur systematically by just like adding another feature to my predictor that has to do with whether there's a question mark or not, and just running a prediction problem on that to predict the outcome better. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But basically what you're doing is you just have some data frame that looks like something on the bottom, and you're just running a prediction on the data frame on the bottom. Perfectly legitimate thing to do, but not a missing data problem. It's just a regular observed data problem with question marks. So what makes missing data, at least according to Don Rubin and company and everybody after all of that, is that you're interested in the full data before the gremlin got to it. And you're interested in some parameter there, and you kind of want to solve back for that. And that's where all the complications lie. Okay. So there are some common missing data models. Missing completely at random goes back to Rubin's original paper that just says that Essentially, the coin flip that the horrible little gremlin flips to put question marks in your data is just a coin that depends on nothing, like in a randomized controlled trial. So ours in particular are independent of missing data marginally. We also have monotone missing at random models that were definitely considered in this paper, but may have been considered earlier as well. I don't know what the original reference is. And there are two statements in this model. One of them is monotonicity, where if I'm censored at some time point I stay censored after that. So this is like study dropout. So I'm in the longitudinal cohort study, and I withdraw my consent, and therefore I sign a little form. And once I sign that form, I'm out, and I don't get to come back. So that means once I sign this form, I don't get measured at that time point or at any point after that. So it's meant to model that kind of censoring. Okay, so that's monotonicity. And then the other assumption is that the missingness indicator is independent of the present underlying variable and future ones, conditional on the observed past, essentially. Okay, then there is block sequential MAR from Zhu, Little, and Kaufbleich paper. I really hate that name because it's not a MAR model, it's actually MNAR, which is a terrible name for an MNAR model. Because if you call something block sequential MAR, it makes you think it's a special kind of MAR, but that's not what it means. Okay, so it's actually the same as independence as in the previous model, but without monotonicity. And it turns out once you lose monotonicity, it stops being MAR for interesting reasons. There's also something that was nameless in Jamie's original paper in '97, but which I named the permutation model later. And that just means that every variable, every indicator is independent of the past counterfactuals up to now, given observed past and unobserved counterfactuals in the future. I mean, you could sometimes people phrase it the other way by doing the opposite order, but it ends up being isomorphic to what I said. And that also is people written about this model a lot. There's also something that I called the block parallel model that first appeared in Karthik and Mohan's paper with Jin Tian and Yuta Pearl in 2013, where each indicator is independent of the others, and the other counterfactuals given, they're independent of the other indicators and its own counterfactuals given all the other counterfactuals. Okay, and there are many, 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 many more that will not all fit on this slide. This is just a representative sample. Actually, they're not representative. They're very systematically picked. They're systematically picked because they're all represented by a graph, it turns out. Although not every paper that originally brought them up thought of them that way. In particular, Robbins didn't think of this as a graph at the time of publication and didn't write it that way. Zhu, Little, and Kaufbleich are like not graphical people either, so they also did not think of this as a graph, but it is. Actually, Robbins, Rudnitsky, and Zhao didn't either, I think. I mean, they do now, but not at the time of publication. Certainly not Rubin. Rubin is not a very graphical guy. Only the last one was implicitly represented as a graph at the time of publication. But they're all graphs. Okay, so quick DAG review. If you don't know about DAGs, this is a DAG. It's a graph with directed edges without directed cycles. Undirected cycles are allowed, like the one on this board. DAGs are nice because I can have a high dimensional distribution on the left-hand side that you can write hopefully in a set of small pieces on the right-hand side. So the pieces in the DAG factorization have to do with every variable conditional on its parents in the graph. If the graph has few edges, you need few parameters to encode the joint distribution for your model. So in the binary model in the picture, I need 31 parameters to specify it if it has no restrictions on the left-hand side, because there are 5 binary variables, so you need 32 minus 1. In that case, 2 to the 5. If I count how many I need to specify the so-called Markov factor, so variable given its parents, on the right-hand side, it's actually 11. So 31 versus 11 is not so impressive, but you could imagine that if my graph has millions of nodes, that starts being important. These kinds of savings you can get if I have a lot of missing edges. The reason more missing edges lead to more savings is because I condition on all the parents. If I have fewer edges, I have fewer parents in terms. And the fewer parents I have, the smaller dimension of the object I need to specify. And so with the very sparse graph, I'm really in business potentially. So Pearl wrote this book that was very influential in machine learning called Probabilistic Reasoning in Intelligent Systems in 1988. That kind of everybody in machine learning read. And basically the big takeaway from that book is this is the reason you want to use probabilistic systems, because you get a lot of savings specifying likelihoods like this. Okay. So in general, yeah, this is what in general the joint distribution is written in this way, and you can get an attractable likelihood in this way. Okay, so let's talk about DAGs to represent missing data models. So we will write down a full data distribution, and as a reminder, that's just the observed variables, the underlying variables, and the indicators. The indicators tell you when question marks happen. We're going to write that as a DAG factorization. Causal models can also be represented by graphs, such as single world intervention graphs. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to talk about missing data. And missing data models are represented by a single graph with both observed and counterfactual variables in the same graph. When I first gave this talk at TOS-CIS, I gave credit to the last paper only, but then people told me that that was not very charitable. And there were this was actually, missing data graphs are an idea whose time has come. And so there were multiple papers around the same time that all proposed some versions of it. And so these are these papers. Although Karthik ended up writing the most about them later, and along with some other authors. So, so this is, on the left, you have like an example of what this graph might look like. So on this graph, what do we have here? We have two underlying variables, x11, x21. These are the variables we're interested in. We also have two indicators because both of these variables are potentially missing. They each have an indicator. And each of these variables has a proxy, which is the version of that variable you see, which is either equal to its value or is equal to question mark, depending on what the R tells it to do. Okay. And every proxy always has parents, underlying variable and indicator, because the proxy is artificial. It's always defined in terms of those two. So the gray edges just means artificial definition, like not really part of the model. The real action is with the blue edges. And so here in particular, you have three edges, and that induces a certain factorization. And that factorization tells you certain things about the way the indicators relate to the underlying variables. And that hopefully tells you what to do. Now, again, this is the block sequential MAR from their paper, and you will not find this graph in that paper. They just do this by writing lists of independences instead. But it doesn't matter. You can do it algebraically, you can do it graphically, it's the same model. We also don't allow certain kinds of edges. The reason the edges on the rightmost graph are not allowed is because the observed x's are artificial and are only functions of those two things. Therefore, they cannot be functions of other things by definition. It's a consequence of consistency. Now, you might try to relax that consistency, and some people may have been working on that, but we'll ignore that for now. And then the other thing we don't allow is we don't allow R's to influence underlying variables. And when I gave this OCS talk, somebody asked me about that. And it's like, why do you get to just say that? And I think like, all I'm going to say is it's a reasonable restriction that essentially all missing data models I know of follow. Yeah, I think essentially the vast majority. And all of causal inference also follows. You can relax it again, and I think that leads to essentially missing data versions of interference problems, which I'm not going to get into right now. Okay, actually, both of these red edges lead to interference problems. And that we can talk about that. That would be a separate talk. Okay. So let's do certain popular models with graphs. So MCAR just means R's are independent of the underlying missing data. So if I write it as a graph, I have a big set of R's and a big set of X's, and X, the observed version, is a function of the R and the underlying variables. And because they're independent, I just don't draw an edge between them. And then the factorization of this graph that follows from this is just what I have over there. And this factorization implies that if I'm interested in the joint distribution of X1, I'm allowed to condition on R equals 1 The reason is because of marginal independence. This is just a regular variable that I happen to not always see. And standard rules of independence apply. And once I condition an r equals to 1, x1 and x become the same by consistency. So x is defined to be x1 if r is 1. So I can replace x1 by x. And once I do that, what I have on the right-hand side is just observed data. And in other words, all that the right-hand side is really saying is if I'm interested in the behavior of x1, it suffices to look at the behavior of the observed cases. Because if I condition an r equals 1, that's just observed cases. So for MCAR, we all know that. And if I teach it like to undergrads, I just mentioned, by the way, a lot of people who have missing data problems restrict to complete cases and carry on with their life. And this is only fine under MCAR in general. Like only if you assume that the indicator has the specific independent structure, it doesn't actually depend on anything else, do you get to look at complete cases and not run into problems. Okay. So that's MCAR. MAR is complicated. I'm not going to get into all the kinds of nonsense you could get with MAR. I'm going to talk about single indicator monotone MAR. So I have a set of observed variables that are always observed, and I have one missing variable. Let's say it's like missing outcome in a regression problem. And the outcome is missing based on some indicator that depends on the underlying variables. So that is a kind of MAR. There are other kinds of MARs that cannot be represented by this kind of graph. In fact, it cannot be represented by graphs at all. Oh yeah, I should say, lots of missing data models are not graphical. That is okay. I will happen to be talking about graphical missing data models in this talk, which is an interesting class, and I argue has some reasons why you might want to prefer it. Like in particular, it's easier to explain to people why. It's easier to think of data generating processes with DAGs because they give you a nice sequence in which things happen. Like if I think about things like non-monotone MAR, which people have, like there isn't really a sequence for non-monotone MAR that makes any sense. So there's a strong suspicion if you're assuming non-monotone MAR, you're doing it for analytic convenience, not because your data generating process in reality actually follows it. So at least with DAGs, you can argue about whether the order is reasonable, the order of events. Okay. So in this particular DAG, it's almost like the MCAR graph, except that there is a common parent that's observed, O, of both x1 and r. And the factorization of this graph is going to be a little bit more complicated, but it's the same factorization variable given its parents. And here, my joint distribution is this missing variable and this observed vector. If I want to join to both of them, I could try to use chain rule, x1 given O, and then O, and then conditional on O, I can insert the R like before. So in this kind of MAR, because I have observed data, there's a set of variables O, I could say that my underlying variables in R are independent given O. So because of that, I can insert R equals 1 for the first term, and then I'm in business. Once I condition an R equals to 1, x1, which is missing, and x, which is observed, become the same. I could replace one by the other and end up with observed data on the last line again. Okay. This, by the way, leads to, like, if I'm interested in just predicting the mean of y, that just literally leads to the G formula, if you know anything about causal inference. In other words, you think of the observed covariates as covariates for, that you adjust for if you think of R as the treatment. Literally the same problem, you get the same estimators, everything is the same. Okay, you could also have missing not at random. Missing not at random, it's like kind of Karenina, right? All the happy families are the same. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own special way. So MNAR literally means not MAR. There are lots of ways not to be MAR. So MNAR is actually a union model of all the ways, all the things that are not MAR, which is very complicated to think about. Whenever I say MNAR, I'm just giving you an example from the giant union model. Okay. Simplest example of MNAR that people often worry about is self-censoring, where the variable itself, its value, somehow influences the probability that it's censored. And this arises in practice all the time, and in general, it's kind of hard to deal with without more assumptions. Here I get this kind of factorization, and in general, the full data distribution is not identified from the observed data distribution with self-censoring. It's analogous to the presence of unobserved confounding in causal inference, specifically unresolvable unobserved confounding. And so without additional trickery, you can't really make progress here. And this is another thing I try to teach machine learning people, which is that you have to take no for an answer with missing data, which is sometimes there is no information in your observed data likelihood for your question. That's unfortunate, but true. So it doesn't matter how algorithmic you get about it, basically, there's just no information. Okay, so this is me writing causal results side by side. So MCAR is like marginally ignorable model, like randomized control trial model. And MAR of the kind that I've discussed is kind of like the conditionally ignorable model where you adjust by covariance. And so the reason I use parenthesis 1 notation is just like an exact syntactic analogy with what happens in causal inference. It's like, it's a kind of potential outcome, if you like. And the formulas are literally identical up to relabeling. Okay, and so MNAR models are sort of like causal models with hidden variables. And the question is, so the standard thing people would say is, like, if you ask ChatGPT about the MNAR, they will say, MNAR is not identified. And ChatGPT would be wrong because it read a bunch of incorrect texts about missing data. Of course, lots of MNAR stuff is identified because remember, MNAR just means not MAR. You could be not MAR in a helpful way or a non-helpful way. So sometimes you get lucky if you're not MAR. So here are some graphs that correspond to identified models that are missing not at random. So the top left is Karthik-Mohan's block parallel model. Next one is for 3 variables. They're all for 3 variables. There are k variable versions of all of these, but they wouldn't fit on the slide. The top left is Karthik's model. Top right is Jamie's model, the permutation model for 3 variables. The bottom left is the block sequential MAR model for 3 variables. And the bottom right is something called this no self-censoring model. One thing you will notice about the bottom right one is not actually a DAG, because there are these green edges that are undirected. And I haven't told you about those, but rest assured, there is a graphical model for this. It's called the chain graph. We'll talk a little bit about it in just a second. But it also has a factorization, and you basically are in the same business as with factorization that helps you because it encodes certain assumptions about your joint. Okay. And these are all identified, meaning that the joint distribution of the axis is a function of the observed data, even though we're MNAR here. So here you're fortuitously MNAR. Okay. So missing data models of a DAG in general follow the following factorization. For the observed axis, they're just given by the underlying axis and the R's by definition. So that part is like deterministic and not really a part of the model. And then you have some sort of factorization involving observed variables, missing variables, and indicators in some way that depends on the graph, because the graph tells you what the parents of things are. And so the arguments for identification and specific missing data models of a DAG are scattered throughout the literature. So for example, there is an argument for each of the, let's say for A, B, and C. Like if you look at the respective papers, there's an argument for why we're identified in each of them. Although it's funny, in C, they never use the word identification anywhere. They just say, I can do maximum likelihood and get the right answer, which is, I guess, the same thing. And then they say, oh, but in some cases, some parameters have more than one global optimum, which is basically not identified, but they don't say it that way. Just interesting. Anyways, the utility of DAGs, of course, is you could just think of all DAGs together and you just try to develop a unified theory for all things representable as a DAG. And so one question you could ask is, given any model, MAR, MNAR, given by a DAG, can we get the target law or the full law? Full law just includes the indicators too. For the latter question, turns out that the answer is actually fairly simple once you see it. For the former one, that's still open, not for lack of trying. We tried very hard, we're still working on it. Okay, and so to get to that, we'll talk about this suspicious non-DAG in D first. Okay, so the no self-censoring model goes like this. So you can take my word for this for now, but the restrictions for this model is every indicator is independent of its underlying variable given everything else, the other variables and the other indicators. And This is symmetric because you condition on everything else. You don't condition on the past, like in the DAG. And this is why you don't necessarily get an ordering and everything here. So the kind of graphical model this is called a chain graph. If you want to read about chain graphs, there's a very nice book by Stefan Lauritsen called Graphical Models. I think a new edition of it is actually coming out. And Stefan is one of the kind of founders of graphical modeling literature, along with Yuda Pearl. And so there's lots of good stuff in that book. I highly recommend it. But in particular, it describes these kinds of hybrid models. And you can think of chain graphs as generalizing Markov random fields, which are undirected models, and DAGs, which are directed models. And so this is kind of a seamless integration of both in some sense. And the kind of factorization you get here looks like this. And if you're familiar with Markov random field literature, what this kind of looks like, it looks like a two-level factorization, where you can kind of think of variables and blocks of undirected edges, and the outer factorization is like a DAG. But then each block further factorizes like a conditional Markov random field. And so here, in particular, the block of the R's kind of has this conditional on the axis. Kind of looks like a conditional Markov random field, the normalizing function that depends on the axis and clique potential. So the usual stuff you would get in an MRF. And the cliques here correspond to cliques of the graph of the R's that also involves the parents that has to have at least one R. That's like the rule. We don't need to get into the generals here, but this is what it turns out to be in this model. And for three variables, this is the factorization you end up with. Okay, so turns out that this factorization is very helpful. And one way to think about this model is what it's doing is it's ruling out self-censoring. So there is no edge in this graph between any indicator and its corresponding X. And all the other edges are there. And so that's enough, it turns out. So if you add even one of them, then you will run into difficulties with self-censoring in general. But if you remove them, actually, you're in business, basically, because you can actually show that this model is identified by thinking really hard about this bivariate factorization due to Chen in 2010, that you can think of like this. Like if I have any conditional distribution, I can think of this as a product of Gibbs factors of every variable given everything else. But that just gives me kind of the main effect. I also need to add the way the variables interact. And the way you do that is you add this kind of odds ratio decomposition. And then the whole thing has to be normalized. So what's at the denominator is just a normalizing function for the numerator. Okay, and there are various ways of rewriting this odds ratio decomposition, which I'm not going to get into. But importantly, all the terms above are variationally independent, and model assumptions imply that they're all functions of the observed data. That's all I'm going to say for now. Functions are not necessarily very simple to describe. I'm certainly not going to get into that right now. And that means we have, oh, sorry, there should be an =1 on the denominator typo. I apologize. And so essentially what that means is we are identified. And so it turns out that, why am I talking about this weird model? Because any DAG model that implies the restrictions in the no self-censoring model is a submodel by definition. And just as a reminder, the restrictions are the first line there. So any DAG that satisfies those will be in this model and therefore will be identified. And actually, any DAG that doesn't satisfy those is not identified, it turns out. So the reason I was talking about that model is it characterizes which DAG models we're in business for and which DAG models we're not in business for the full law, which is the law of the O, the X1, and the R. And this is the theorem that Rohit and Razi came up with.
Sorry, that was quite quick. Can I just check I've understood? So if you go back one slide.
Yes.
And another slide. You're saying that if the top line holds,
yes,
then the joint distribution of the R's and the X's is identified.
Yes.
The X's and the O.
Yes.
So it's identified. And if those restrictions on the top line, if they're not satisfied,
Yes,
then it's just not that joint distribution is not identified.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and the way, yeah, I see your hand too. And the way you check it is you would just check by d-separation whether this holds for every R, because that's how you check things in a DAG, right? I didn't talk about d-separation, but that would take too long. Go ahead.
So you specify there that that's the case for DAGs. This model isn't a DAG.
Yeah, it's a chain graph.
Non-DAGs that could be identifiable.
Oh yeah, any DAG or not DAG that satisfies these will be a submodel and will be identified. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I guess.
In fact, like in our paper, we talk about certain things that are not DAGs that will satisfy this. Yeah. Was that your question, or did you have another?
So no, So are there non-DAGs that are not a submodel of this that are identifiable?
Oh yeah, in fact, you don't even have to be a graphical model. There is all sorts of stuff. This is specifically for graphical models. Yeah. But even if you're a non-DAG, you satisfy this, you're also in business.
Yeah.
Because that's just what a submodel, if you're a submodel, you have to be identified. Yeah, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if can you give some heuristics about why this is complete? Is it because it kind of gives you all the marginals that are actually identified?
Well, because we have a theorem. So if we're satisfied, if those independencies are satisfied, you're a submodel, so that's easy. That half. So the completeness is the other half, which is, well, what would have to be graphically the case for that independence to be not hold by d-separation in the DAG? Well, it turns out that it's about these two cases. That was the theorem. So the first case is there is a self-censoring edge. So that one is easy. We know about that case because self-censoring is not identified in general. The second case is what we call a colluder. That's a bit of a joke. We were writing this paper. It's a special collider. So we were writing this paper at the time that Trump was talking about collusion a lot. So anyways, so the idea being that a variable and its indicator are together colluding by pointing to another indicator. And that structure, if it exists, is going to create problems for you. There's going to be something that you will not be able to identify if that structure exists. Okay, so if these structures do not exist for any pair, you're in business. You're a submodel of the no self-censoring model. And if they do exist, you're not. So that's the graphical characterization. So we could together read the theorem about why it has to be these structures, but that's what it is. For like ADMGs, if you know what that is, it's a little bit harder, but there is a similar characterization for ADMGs.
What I wanted to ask was there are kind of two parts of this. One is like there's these conditional independencies, which are kind of basically saying you can get the margin, those marginals you can get from your data kind of happen to be there because that's kind of what those
this is not about marginals because remember, like this independence only holds conditional and everything else. If I just look at marginal, like marginally everything is dependent here.
But I was thinking about the factorization that things like last term like x3 r12, that's kind of terms where you can identify from x3 the marginal. No,
it's not obvious. I mean, you can, but you have to go through the joint. It's not obvious how to do the margin by itself.
Okay, maybe I got the wrong two.
Yeah, in particular, like x3 depends on r3 in that if you just condition on the r's.
Okay.
You have to condition on everything, including the other x's. Sorry, you have your hand up too?
Yeah, I'm still trying to get my head around the consequences of it. So if you go forwards 2 slides again, sorry. So here, yeah. So any DAG model that isn't a submodel of NSC is not identified.
Yeah, and it's going to have one of these somewhere, one of these two things.
So there are non-DAG models that are identified.
Yeah.
The implication, therefore, is that any DAG model that is not, in some sense, linkable to NSC, any non-DAG that is identified but not linkable to NSC does not have any DAGs that are consistent with it. Is that the implication there?
No. Okay, so anything is consistent with the DAG, but that's a trivial thing to say because like all I have to do to be consistent with the DAG is write down the chain rule. Chain rule is just a complete DAG. So just because you're consistent with the DAG doesn't say very much in and of itself. It's more like are you using anything from the fact that your chain rule is reduced in some way, something like that.
Okay, because so NSC is not a DAG. First, yes, yep.
Yeah.
So, and any DAG that is identified as a submodel of NSC.
Yes.
So the not other non-DAGs that are identified do not have any DAG submodels unless they are also in NSC. Is that that? Yeah. Okay, that's what I was trying to. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is for all DAGs. So by necessity, it follows what you said. Yeah. Okay. So the only thing I actually haven't. So self-censoring is pretty easy. Like if I have self-censoring, I can't even tell you what the arity of the variable is because I can always just censor myself whenever I'm 2. Like let's say I'm 0, 1, and 2. Whenever 2, I put question mark. So you don't even know if I'm ternary or binary, basically. So self-censoring is very easy. Colluders are a little bit harder. So I have this very busy slide. I'm not going to explain this slide to you because I don't have time and I don't think it's very important. But the point is, if I have a colluder, like here's a simple example of a colluder on this DAG. So X11 and R1 both point to R2. So I will tell you what's not identified there. What's not identified is the conditional distribution of R2 given X11 and given that R1 is 0. If R1 is 0, it means that the other parent is missing. And that turns out that you're not going to get, there's no information about that specific probability in the data. And so this table basically shows like for a categorical case why that is basically. So you could basically have a counterexample where I have 2 things with a different probability but the same observed data distribution. So then you're not identified, you're not invertible from observed data to that parameter. Okay. So colluders really do create a problem is the point. It's just a little harder to see that. Okay, so all right, so we can do if we are in NSC, we are identified. If we are identified, we can do maximum likelihood inference. Actually, we can do maximum likelihood anyways, because like max likelihood is like you just pass it to the maximizer. Maximizers maximize functions. They don't care if they're identified or not. The only thing that's going to happen is there's going to be many maximizers. And you're going to have a big region. And then if you're in the business of learning about parameters, maybe that won't be so helpful. But if you are identified, there's a single global maximum. And provided that you know how to deal with non-convex problems, you will hopefully find it. And then you will be in the business. Okay, so if the whole model is, if my DAG model is a submodel of the NSC, the underlying distribution, the target law and the nuisance law are both functionals of the observed data. The whole thing factorizes like the whole full data factorizes like a DAG. Each factor, which is a conditional in the full law, is an algebraic functional of the observed data. But this functional is not necessarily a conditional. It's actually much more complicated, which again, I'm not necessarily going to get into, although when I get to imputation, you'll maybe see what I mean. And so, but the point is I can just maximize this observed likelihood directly. Like in other words, I just write down the likelihood. And what's my likelihood? It's just the DAG factorization. The only extra thing I do for missing data is that for every row, I consult what's 1, which of the R's are 1s. And those I leave alone. And for any R's that are 0, I just sum over the corresponding X's, because for that row, I don't see those X's. So it's like selective marginalization based on what missingness pattern there is, right? That's all that I'm trying to write here. Maybe it's hard to see. So, okay, but the point is this is a likelihood. I could pass it to a maximizer or I could use EM. And that will work, basically. Because you could always do it, but if I'm in this class, then this will work well, meaning that there's a global maximum to find. Okay, so in my OCIS talk, I also talk about semi-parametrics. This is what I'm going to skip. I'm going to talk about imputation instead. So this concludes the first part of my talk, where I'm scamming Cambridge by coming here and giving a talk I've already given. I'm sorry, but I had to talk about this because the imputation is about this model. So I had to talk about this model first. Okay, so imputation is really important. So I think in practice, it's probably the most important missing data method because most people don't want to think about missing data. They just want to run their analysis. So they download MICE and they run MICE or Amelia or something. I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I've done it before in papers. Popular software packages such as MICE and Amelia are based on MAR. Sort of. Like Amelia is based on MAR, but Amelia assumes that everything is multivariate Gaussian, which is certainly an assumption you could make. Don't think it's true or anything. The problem with MICE is that the way MICE works, if you've ever played with MICE, is it asks you to specify imputing distribution over columns given everything else. And it never actually checks. And then it runs what's effectively a Gibbs sampler. But it never actually ensures that your Gibbs factors are consistent for a particular joint. And the Gibbs theorem, like you need that actually. You first start with the joint, then you look at all the conditionals. And then it says that if you sample with those conditionals, you will get a joint sample eventually once convergence is achieved. If you just start specifying conditionals first, how do you know you even have a joint? So this is a problem that MICE has. Like what I said at the beginning of my talk is MICE is either MAR or nonsense. What I mean by that is if I have consistent Gibbs factors in MICE, then it's MAR, basically, or equivalent to MAR. If it doesn't have consistent Gibbs factors, it's nothing, because what are you even imputing? You don't have a joint. You have no theorems about what you're even doing. Okay, so I will try to provide some sort of principal imputation alternative for MNAR. So the difficulty with MNAR is your imputing distributions are complicated. They don't look like conditionals anymore. With MAR, for every row under MAR, missing data is independent of the indicator given observed data. So that naturally means your imputing distributions are all conditionals of the observed data, which is very helpful and is not true in MNAR. Okay. So the strategy that will always work if we're in this no-cell censoring model, so if any of these DAGs we're talking about, if every pattern is available, it may also work in some other cases if we have no support. This no support business, I think, is actually really important because missing data occurs in all analyses. Lots of analyses are high dimensional. If my analysis is high dimensional, have k variables, I have 2 to the k possible missingness patterns because everything is either observed or not observed. Well, if I have 2 to the k missingness patterns and reasonable sample sizes, how likely is it that all the patterns have support in the data? Probably not going to happen, right? So most patterns have no support. And actually, lots of missing data models stop working when you have no pattern support. Like, actually, this is a little bit underexplored. Like, if I give you a missing data model, it's not completely clear what patterns are actually load-bearing. Like, everybody knows you need complete cases. Otherwise, it's not really missing data anymore. But other than complete cases, you probably need some other patterns to be there. Which patterns are those? Well, that depends on the model. And I think that question is kind of underexplored, actually. Like, if I give you like one of the models like a couple of slides ago, like and ask you which patterns are necessary, like I don't think people know in general. Okay, so but if you want to apply missing data in a principled way in high dimensional problems, I think we all do. Probably worth thinking about this question because you're going to have a lot of missing data patterns with no support. Probably still want to run something, right? Okay. So we have this algorithm, it's called MISPER, which stands for multivariate imputation for supported pattern recursion. Why is it that? Because it had to have a cutesy algorithm, an acronym. And why that? Because, well, that's just not negotiable, I guess. Okay. So let's do the basic setup. So we have a missingness pattern, little r. That's like a realization of the r's. Like that's what the ones or the zeros that we have. We want to identify for every pattern the joint distribution of the missingness and the observable variables together. And we can re-express this by chain rule. This is well known into something called the interpolation density and the extrapolation density. So the interpolation density is observed data because of the way I wrote it, because I'm only picking out the x's for whom the pattern is 1. So those x's become observed for that row only, or rows where those r's are 1, and then always observed. So that second term is fine. It's all observed data. The first term is not fine because the stuff in front of the conditioning bar is missing. So we need that distribution to sample if you're going to be imputing things for that pattern. Okay? That's, again, this is not new. Like everybody who does imputation basically does some version of this. Okay. So we have to think about the first term. So what are we going to do? We're going to use 3 ideas. The first idea is trivial, which is that if R is complete cases, then we're fine. The whole thing is identified because complete cases, everything is observed. That's the base case. Idea number 2 is that to identify the joint of all the variables given some pattern, we don't need the joint necessarily, we just need the Gibbs factors that come from this joint, because intuitively, if I know the Gibbs factors, I can just sample as many samples as I want from the joint. So it's effectively, it's like a numeric identification. Like I can identify it if you let me give me some CPU. Like I could give you as much information as you like about it. Okay, so why Gibbs factors? Because conditionals are often simpler than joints. Okay, so that's idea number 2. Idea number 3, well, what do we have to work with? We are graphical model people. So we are going to use independences implied by the graph. The independences are every variable in a DAG is independent of its non-parental, non-descendants given its parents. That's what they call the local Markov property, and any logical implication of that. Okay, and if you know about d-separation, it's just whatever d-separation tells you. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to use independences to identify Gibbs factors for a given pattern in terms of some other Gibbs factor or another joint with a bigger pattern. Bigger pattern meaning a pattern with more ones. The more ones you have, the easier your life is. The easiest pattern is the complete cases, where everything is 1. The next easiest is the pattern with a single 0. The next easiest is with 2 zeros, and so on. So we're going to start from the easiest and try to work our way down using independences to express harder things in terms of easier things. And we're going to do this recursively until we get everything, hopefully. Okay. So here is a graph in the top right corner. We're going to omit the proxies because they're always in the same place and they always have the same parents. They're artificial. And it will just take up valuable slide real estate. Okay, so we need to identify the joint distribution of the x's given any pattern here. There are no O's for simplicity here.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's 3 o'clock now.
Okay.
So
I have to stop, huh?
No, you don't have to stop, but people might need to leave. And
Okay.
and if you prioritize, if there are things that you can drop, then
Sure. Okay, I will take like 3 minutes maybe. I'm almost
I don't want to rush you. I mean, we've sat here for an hour, so we don't want to miss the crucial things.
Yeah. It's actually, this is a busy slide with a very simple idea. The idea goes like this. The top thing is just complete cases. Complete cases are trivially fine. Once we go further in, we factorize the term in terms of things that are available for the pattern. So for example, in the second line, we have x1, 2 because the pattern for 1 and 2 are available. So the last term is always missing data. And the first term, we just see if we could express it in terms of the terms above that were already handled using independences in the graph. And this is what I do when I cross things out. I replace one pattern by another if the graph allows me to do that. That's it. That's the whole slide. I just do that recursively for everything. The only other thing is sometimes I have a joint, and rather than getting the joint directly, like further down, I get 2 Gibbs factors. And each Gibbs factor, I do the substitution using a donor pattern and potentially different donor pattern for different Gibbs factors. But once I have the Gibbs factors for the joint, I can just Gibbs it and get it. Okay. The induction in this imputation strategy may be summarized by a pattern DAG, where vertices are patterns and a pattern R is a parent of another if it's donor. And so here is just the usual, like, the representation of the partial order and subsets, because here all patterns have support. So this is not very interesting in and of itself. It's just something we pointed out for what follows. This strategy where you use the pattern with one more R than before assumes that all the patterns have support. But that might not happen. What might happen is you might have some patterns that have no support in the data. But you could still run the same strategy if you could find an appropriate donor pattern by some sort of search that does have support. And so here we have a same graph almost with a single missing edge, which I strategically remove so things stay identified. Again, it's just an example, toy example. So here there are some patterns in red that are not identified. They are identified, but they have no support. So the probability, so you can think of the joint distribution as having no support. So it's probability 0 and in red. And so what ends up happening is in 2 places, rather than look up a donor pattern with 1 more 1 in red, which I cannot do because they have no support, I just keep looking basically. And in this particular case, it happens that I could find a bigger pattern with more ones that does have support. So it's essentially the same idea, but I look harder for where to borrow information from. And I still use basically independences in the graph. And the pattern DAG needs to be modified if patterns have no support. So I start with a complete kind of Haas diagram for partial order and subsets, and I drop things that don't have support. And I like put edges if I borrow information into this graph. So that's what we call the pattern graph. And here we have a reduced pattern graph for the previous example. And we have algorithms for constructing these graphs, PMID and PMID plus, which you do if you have the second one, if we have some patterns with no support. In PMID, we just do, it's sort of trivial. If we are in a no self-censoring model, we can always construct it. And it's just going to end up with a Haas diagram and subsets, essentially. If in PMID plus, what we have to do is we maintain a set of things we've identified so far, and we do a search problem for donor patterns for things we haven't yet. And if that succeeds, we end up constructing a graph like in the previous slide. And because even though it is a search problem, the actual overall algorithm is polynomial in the number of missing variables and how many usable patterns we have, which is important because it's okay to be polynomial in that, because at the very least, you should be able to list the patterns that we have. Because if you cannot even list the patterns that you have no business doing the missing data problem at all, right? Because you can't even enumerate what you're doing. Okay, and the actual algorithm for imputation goes like this. If the patterns are available, we construct it using PMID, otherwise via PMID plus. In the base case, we fit the joint for the complete cases. For the inductive case, we fit all the Gibbs factors if they're directly available, or from a donor pattern if they're not available. And then once we have Gibbs factors, we could run Gibbs to impute the joint that we need for every pattern. And notice, however, that we have to figure out model congeniality issues, and I can talk about that if there are questions later, because a lot of these things are margins of each other, and they're not all straightforwardly conditionals. Okay, so we have some sim studies in our paper. This is the graphs that we used. Only A is MAR. The others are all various flavors of MNAR. And we compare to mice. Mice, unsurprisingly, exhibits varying amounts of biases for things that are not MAR. I think the pluses are cases where you have missing patterns, so patterns with no support. Yeah. So in some of these, mice takes a long time or just fails to work. Yeah, I think this wasn't, in some sense, very interesting because we know mice is not necessarily going to do well if we're MNAR. Mice can be surprisingly hard to break, meaning that it sometimes will have low bias even under MNAR. People have seen that before. There are ways to break it if you're really curious, always, obviously. It's not magic. Yeah, it's often significantly faster as well than mice, at least the implementation we tried. Okay, so to conclude, lots, but not all, missing data models have full laws that factorize as a DAG. We have given a simple characterization of identified models of this DAG using this no self-censoring model, which itself is a chain graph. We can use parametric inference in this class just by maximizing the likelihood if we have it. And we've also described an imputation method that works for this class, and in some cases not in this class. There are lots of related problems, such as doing hidden variables and missing data together, which we have in our paper as well. Identification of marginal distributions, which is difficult. Model selection in the presence of missing data, which is also difficult. How to parameterize missing data models in general, which is important for general applicability of imputation. And I think there is a big gap in this kind of work where, like if everything is Gaussian, everything is easy. If everything is categorical, everything is easy. Otherwise, things are not easy. The reason they're not easy is you end up with selective marginalization. Doing likelihoods for marginal models is fiendishly hard in general, it turns out. People are working on it in the context of causal inference as well. The relationship between causal diagrams and missing data graphs is also interesting. People often get confused by this. Missing data graphs are not causal diagrams. We can talk about that too. They're a different kind of graph entirely. Thank you, and sorry I took so long.